My son Marcus looked across the mahogany dining table I'd polished every Sunday for 23 years and said the words that would haunt me forever. "Face it, Mom. You have no value to this family anymore." The wine glasses trembled as his wife Victoria nodded in agreement, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier I'd saved 3 months to buy. What they didn't know was that by morning they'd discovered just how much my worthless signature was actually worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Carrie Stewart, and I thought I knew what love looked like. For 58 years, I believed family meant sacrifice, support, and standing by each other through everything. I raised Marcus as a single mother after his father walked out when he was barely 3 years old. Those early years were a blur of double shifts at the diner, sleepless nights studying for my real estate license, and every spare dollar going toward his baseball cleats, school supplies, and college fund. The dining room where everything fell apart had been my pride and joy. Every piece of furniture told a story of hard work and determination. The mahogany table came from an estate sale where I'd haggled for hours, knowing Marcus needed a proper place to do his homework. The china cabinet held dishes I'd collected one piece at a time from garage sales and thrift stores, slowly building a set worthy of family gatherings. The crystal chandelier overhead had been my gift to myself after closing my first $1 million real estate deal. That Sunday evening in October started like hundreds of others. I'd spent the entire day preparing Marcus's favorite meal, herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables, and my grandmother's famous apple pie. The house smelled like cinnamon and rosemary, warm and inviting. I'd set the table with my best china, the pieces that had taken me 15 years to collect. Fresh flowers from my garden sat in the center, their autumn colors reflecting the season's change. Marcus arrived with Victoria at exactly 6 o'clock, just as I'd taught him growing up. Punctuality mattered, I'd always said. Respect for others' time showed character. He looked handsome in his navy blazer and crisp white shirt, every inch the successful attorney I'd worked 3 jobs to help him become. Victoria glided in beside him, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her makeup flawless. "Something smells incredible," Marcus said, kissing my cheek with the mechanical precision he'd developed over the past few years. The warmth that used to light up his eyes when he hugged me had gradually dimmed, replaced by something that felt more like obligation than affection. "I made all your favorites," I replied, smoothing my apron nervously. I'd changed clothes 3 times, wanting everything to be perfect. "Victoria, that dress is stunning. Is it new?" She barely glanced at me as she checked her phone. "From Milan. Marcus surprised me with a shopping trip last month." Her voice carried that polished tone she'd perfected, each word carefully measured to remind me of the distance between our worlds. We settled into our usual seats around the table. I'd placed Marcus at the head, the position his father should have occupied if he'd stayed. Victoria sat to his right, positioned like a queen surveying her domain. I took my place across from her, the same spot I'd occupied for every family meal, since Marcus was old enough to sit in a regular chair. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Marcus told me about a case he'd won, speaking in legal terms I didn't fully understand but nodded along to anyway. Victoria mentioned a charity luncheon she'd attended, describing the other wives with casual dismissal. I served the lamb and vegetables, my hands steady despite the nervous flutter in my stomach that had become increasingly common during these dinners. "This is delicious, Mom," Marcus said, cutting into his meat with surgical precision. "You always were the best cook." The compliment should have warmed me, but something in his tone felt distant, like he was speaking to a restaurant server rather than the woman who'd raised him. I pushed the feeling aside and focused on making conversation. "How's the new house coming along?" I asked, genuinely interested in their renovation project. They'd bought a sprawling colonial in the most exclusive neighborhood in town, the kind of place I'd dreamed of showing clients but never imagined living in myself. Victoria's eyes lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm I'd seen from her all evening. "Oh, it's going to be absolutely spectacular. We're putting in a wine cellar, And the kitchen will have professional-grade everything. Marble countertops imported from Italy, custom cabinets, the works. That sounds wonderful, I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I wanted them to be happy. You'll have to have me over once it's finished. The words hung in the air for a moment too long. Marcus and Victoria exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret, and something cold settled in my chest. Actually, Mom, that's something we wanted to talk to you about, Marcus said, setting down his fork with deliberate care. His lawyer voice had emerged, the one he used for difficult negotiations. About the future, I mean. I felt my smile falter, but tried to maintain composure. What about it? Victoria leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her wineglass. We've been thinking about family dynamics, Carrie. How relationships evolve as people get older. The way she said my name instead of calling me Mom sent a chill down my spine. She'd never been warm toward me, but there had always been at least superficial respect. This felt different. Marcus cleared his throat. The thing is, Mom, Victoria and I are building a new life together. We have our own traditions now, our own circle of friends. We're thinking about starting a family soon. That's wonderful news, I said, though something in his tone made me hesitate. I can't wait to be a grandmother. Another look passed between them, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's just it, though. Victoria's family has different traditions. Her parents have a place in the Hamptons where they spend holidays, and her grandmother has this beautiful estate in Connecticut where all the family gatherings happen. My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice steady. That sounds lovely. I'm sure we can work out a schedule so the baby can spend time with both families. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, Carrie, that's sweet, but it's not really practical. Marcus needs to focus on his career, and I need to maintain my social connections. We can't be running all over town trying to keep everyone happy. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I struggled to understand what they were really saying. I'm not asking you to run anywhere. This is your home. This will always be your home. Marcus looked down at his plate, unable to meet my eyes. That's the thing, Mom. This isn't really our home anymore. We've moved on. We're adults with our own lives, our own priorities. The dining room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around me. The chandelier's light seemed too bright, too harsh. What are you trying to tell me? Victoria took a sip of wine before answering, her voice steady and cruel. What Marcus is trying to say is that you're becoming a burden. These dinners, the constant phone calls, the way you cling to the past, it's not healthy for any of us. The word burden landed like a slap across my face. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to contradict her, to defend me, to show some trace of the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead, he just stared at his hands. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I raised you, Marcus. I gave you everything I had. Finally, he looked up, and his eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
And I'm grateful for that, I really am. But that was your job as a parent. It doesn't mean I owe you my entire adult life. The casual cruelty of his words made my chest tighten. I never said you owed me anything. I just want to be part of your life. I want to know my grandchildren. Victoria set down her wine glass with a sharp clink against the china. Here's the reality, Carrie. You're getting older. You live alone in this big house, working a job that's honestly beneath Marcus's station now. When we have children, they'll need to be around successful, influential people. They'll need to learn how to move in the right circles. What are you saying? The question came out as barely a whisper. Marcus finally found his voice, though he still couldn't look directly at me. We're saying that maybe it's time for some distance. For you to find your own life, separate from ours. The room spun around me. The dining room I'd lovingly furnished, the meal I'd spent all day preparing, the family I'd sacrificed everything to create. It all felt like it was dissolving before my eyes. But I am your family, I said, hating how desperate I sounded. You're my son, my only child. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was an interesting specimen. Family isn't just about blood, Carrie. It's about mutual benefit, shared values, common goals. What exactly do you bring to Marcus's life now? What value do you add? The question hung in the air like poison gas. I looked around the table at the remnants of our meal, at the flowers I'd carefully arranged, at the china I'd spent years collecting. What value did I add? I love him, I said simply, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. Marcus finally met my eyes, and what I saw there broke something inside me. Love isn't enough anymore, Mom. I need more than that. Victoria and I have goals, ambitions. We're going places. And honestly, he paused, seeming to gather courage for the final blow. Face it, Mom, you have no value to this family anymore. The words echoed in the sudden silence. No value. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his college, who had sat through every baseball game and school play, who had sacrificed her own dreams so he could chase his, had no value. Victoria nodded approvingly, as if Marcus had finally said what she'd been waiting to hear. It's harsh, but it's honest. You're holding him back, Carrie. Holding us back. When we have children, we need them to see strength, success, influence. Not... She gestured vaguely in my direction. This. I sat there, feeling smaller with each passing second. The dining room that had been my sanctuary now felt like a courtroom where I had just been found guilty of the crime of existing. The chandelier's light seemed to mock me, illuminating my worthlessness for all to see. So what are you saying? I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. We're saying goodbye, Mom, Marcus said, his voice softer now but no less devastating. Not forever, maybe, but for now. Until you figure out who you are without us. Victoria reached across the table and patted my hand with false sympathy. Think of it as an opportunity, Carrie. A chance to reinvent yourself. Maybe travel, take up a hobby, find some friends your own age. Stop living through Marcus and start living for yourself. The condescension in her voice made my skin crawl, but I was too shocked to respond. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be my son, the boy I'd loved more than life itself, telling me I had no value. Marcus stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. We should go. Early day tomorrow. But you haven't had dessert, I said automatically, clinging to the familiar routine of hospitality. I made your favorite apple pie. Maybe next time, he said, though we all knew there wouldn't be a next time. Not for a long while. They gathered their things with efficient movements, as if they couldn't wait to escape. Victoria picked up her designer purse and checked her reflection in its compact mirror. Marcus straightened his tie and looked around the dining room one last time. Thanks for dinner, Mom, he said, kissing my cheek again with that same mechanical precision. Take care of yourself. And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the dining room surrounded by the remnants of what I'd thought was a family dinner but had actually been an execution. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chairs, the half-eaten food, the flowers that now looked wilted and sad. The house felt different somehow, hollow and echoing. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed magnified. I looked around at the furniture I'd chosen so carefully, the decorations I'd placed with such love, and wondered if any of it mattered anymore. Slowly, I began clearing the table. The china clinked together as I stacked the plates, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Victoria's lipstick had left a mark on her wine glass, a red smear that looked like a wound. I rinsed it away under the hot water, watching the color swirl down the drain. As I loaded the dishwasher, my hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while my mind reeled. Had I really been that blind? Had I been so focused on loving Marcus that I'd failed to see how far apart we'd grown? When had my devotion become a burden? When had my love become worthless? The apple pie sat untouched on the counter, its golden crust now cold and uninviting. I'd spent hours on it, rolling the dough by hand, peeling each apple with careful precision, adding just the right amount of cinnamon and sugar. All for nothing. I walked through the house, turning off lights and checking locks with the same routine I'd followed for decades. But everything felt different now. The photographs lining the hallway, Marcus at every stage of his life, seemed to mock me. Birthday parties where I'd been the only parent because his father had already abandoned us. Graduation ceremonies where I'd cheered the loudest. Holiday mornings where we'd opened presents together, just the two of us against the world. When had that stopped being enough? When had I stopped being enough? In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, ugly sobs of complete devastation. My chest heaved with the force of it, years of suppressed worry and growing distance finally breaking free. I cried for the little boy who used to crawl into this bed during thunderstorms, whispering that he'd always take care of me. I cried for the teenager who'd promised to call every day when he left for college. I cried for the young man who'd once told me I was the strongest person he knew. And I cried for the woman I'd apparently become. Worthless, burdensome, with nothing to offer the family she'd built her entire life around. The tears eventually stopped, leaving me empty and exhausted. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, and wondered what came next. How do you rebuild a life when the people you built it for tell you it has no value? But as the hours passed and dawn began to creep through the curtains, something else began to stir inside me. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the sound of my breathing. Then it grew stronger, more insistent. If I truly had no value to them, then what did I owe them in return? I got up and walked to my desk, pulling out the leather portfolio I kept locked in the bottom drawer. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to need. My will, insurance policies, investment statements, papers that represented a lifetime of careful planning and hard work. The will was dated just 2 years ago, leaving everything to Marcus and any future children he might have. Every penny of my savings, every stick of furniture, every piece of jewelry my mother had left me, all of it destined for the son who had just told me I had no value. I stared at the pages until the words blurred together, and that whisper inside me grew to a roar. They wanted to cut me out of their lives? They wanted to treat me like I was worthless? Fine. But they were about to learn that worthless people don't leave inheritances. I reached for my phone to call my attorney, then stopped. It was nearly midnight, far too late for business calls. But that gave me time to think, to plan, to make sure I did this right. Because if Marcus wanted to find out what no value really looked like, I was more than happy to show him. The foundation of our relationship had cracked beyond repair that night. But I was the one who would decide what rose from the ruins. Morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains like an unwelcome guest, illuminating the tear-stained tissues scattered across my nightstand. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through every word Marcus had spoken, every dismissive glance Victoria had given me. The phrase "no value" echoed in my head like a broken record, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. I dragged myself to the kitchen and went through the motions of making coffee, my hands shaking as I measured the grounds. The dining room was visible through the archway, the table still bearing the faint impressions from last night's place settings. I'd cleaned everything, but the ghost of that meal lingered like smoke in the air. My phone sat silent on the counter, and for a moment I considered calling Marcus. Maybe in the harsh light of morning he'd realize what he'd done. Maybe he'd apologize, take back those cruel words, tell me Victoria had put him up to it. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was wishful thinking. The coldness in his eyes had been real. The finality in his voice had been genuine. I poured my coffee and walked to the living room, settling into the armchair where I'd spent countless evenings reading to Marcus when he was small. The house felt enormous around me, every room echoing with memories that now felt like accusations. Had I really been so blind to think our relationship was solid? Had I misread every interaction, every phone call, every stilted conversation over the past few years? The portfolio of documents sat on the coffee table where I'd left it. its leather surface worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were the building blocks of my financial life, accumulated through decades of careful saving and smart investments. My real estate career had been more successful than Marcus ever knew. While he was growing up, I downplayed my achievements, not wanting him to feel overshadowed or pressured. I'd lived modestly, driven old cars, shopped at discount stores, all so he could have the best of everything. But the modest lifestyle had been a choice, not a necessity. The investment accounts I'd built over 25 years contained a sum that would have shocked my son. The real estate properties I'd quietly acquired in up-and-coming neighborhoods had appreciated beyond my wildest dreams. The life insurance policy I'd maintained since Marcus was born would have set him up for life. All of it earmarked for the boy who now considered me worthless. I opened the portfolio and spread the documents across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle. Bank statements showing balances that had grown steadily over the years. Investment summaries detailing a diversified portfolio worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Property deeds for rental units that generated steady monthly income. And there, paper clipped to the back of the folder, my will. The document was written in the careful language lawyers preferred, but its meaning was crystal clear. Everything I owned, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd accumulated through decades of sacrifice and smart decisions, would go to Marcus upon my death. And if he predeceased me, it would go to his children. The woman he'd just told had no value, was planning to make him a very wealthy man. I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was bitter and hollow, like the taste of betrayal still coating my tongue. How would Marcus react if he knew? If he understood that his harsh words had just cost him a fortune he didn't even know existed? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its deep notes reverberating through the quiet house. Soon the rest of the world would be starting their Monday morning routines, heading to offices and appointments, dealing with the mundane concerns of everyday life. But I had more important business to attend to. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Richard Blackwood had been my attorney for 15 years, handling everything from real estate transactions to estate planning. He was discreet, thorough, and expensive, but worth every penny. More importantly, he understood that sometimes legal matters required delicate handling. Carrie. His familiar voice came through the speaker after 2 rings. This is early for you. Is everything all right? I almost laughed at the question. Nothing would ever be all right again, but that wasn't Richard's problem to solve. I need to make some changes to my will, Richard. Significant changes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see. Would you prefer to discuss this over the phone, or would you like to come in? I'll come in. How's 10 o'clock? I'll make time. Carrie, are you sure you're okay? I sound like a woman who's finally seeing clearly, I interrupted. I'll see you at 10. I hung up before he could ask more questions. Richard was perceptive enough to read between the lines, and professional enough not to pry beyond what was necessary for the legal work. He'd handled enough family disputes over the years to recognize the tone of a client who'd been pushed too far. The shower was scalding hot, the water pressure beating against my skin like tiny hammers. I stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting the heat work through the tension in my shoulders and neck. When I finally stepped out, I felt marginally more human, though the hollow ache in my chest remained untouched. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit I'd bought for important client meetings. The jacket was well-tailored, expensive without being showy, the kind of outfit that commanded respect in professional settings. I'd learned long ago that appearance mattered in business, that people made assumptions based on what they saw before you ever opened your mouth. My reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 58 years. The stress of last night had carved new lines around my eyes, and my usually careful makeup couldn't quite hide the pallor of sleeplessness. But there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been there before. A hardness around the edges, a steely determination that transformed grief into purpose. I drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past houses where I'd sold properties to young families, where I'd helped empty nesters downsize, where I'd guided first-time buyers through the biggest purchase of their lives. Real estate had been more than a career for me. It had been a calling. I'd built my reputation on integrity, on putting clients' needs first, on delivering results even when the market was challenging. That reputation had made me wealthy, though I'd never flaunted it. While other successful agents drove luxury cars and wore designer clothes, I'd maintained the same modest lifestyle I'd established when Marcus was young. Every dollar saved had been another dollar for his future, another brick in the foundation of security I was building for him. Richard's office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian mansion in the historic district, its mahogany-paneled walls and Persian rugs, speaking of old money and established success. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, had been with him longer than I'd been his client, and she greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that made you feel like the most important person in her day. "Mr. Blackwood is ready for you, Mrs. Stewart," she said, gesturing toward the familiar door marked with his name in gold lettering. "Can I bring you some coffee?" "That would be wonderful, thank you." Richard stood as I entered, his silver hair perfectly styled, his handshake firm and reassuring. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, a man who'd seen enough family drama to fill several novels, yet still maintained an air of distinguished calm that served his clients well. "Carrie, please, sit down," he said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around his desk. "You sounded upset on the phone. Has something happened?" I settled into the chair I'd occupied during many previous visits, feeling the familiar comfort of the soft leather and the subtle scent of lemon oil from the antique furniture. This office had been witness to some of the most important decisions of my adult life, and today would add another chapter to that history. "My son and I had a conversation last night," I began, choosing my words carefully. "It became clear that our relationship has changed in ways I hadn't fully understood." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but attentive. "I see. And this has prompted you to reconsider your estate planning?" "Completely reconsider it," I confirmed. "I want to make new arrangements for my assets, and I want to ensure they're ironclad. No possibility of challenge, no room for misinterpretation." He reached for a legal pad and pen, his movements deliberate and professional. "All right, let's start with the basics. Your current will leaves everything to Marcus, with provisions for any children he might have. What changes are you considering?" The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I felt the weight of what I was about to do. Once these words were spoken, once these changes were made, there would be no going back. I'd be severing the final thread that connected me to the son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved more than my own life. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as worthless, who wanted me out of his life, who considered my love a burden. If he could discard me so easily, then I could return the favor. "I want to leave everything to charity," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "Educational scholarships for underprivileged children, medical research, organizations that help single mothers. I want my money to go to people who need it, who'll appreciate it, who won't take it for granted." Richard's pen stopped moving across the page. He looked up at me with the kind of measured expression that meant he was choosing his words very carefully. "Carrie, that's a significant change. Are you certain this is what you want? Sometimes family disputes can be resolved with time and communication." I thought about Marcus's cold eyes, Victoria's contemptuous smile, the casual cruelty with which they'd dismissed decades of love and sacrifice. "There's nothing to resolve, Richard. They made their position very clear. They don't want me in their lives, and they certainly don't need my money." "What about grandchildren? Future generations you haven't met yet?" The question was like a knife twisting in an old wound. I dreamed of being a grandmother, of having little ones to spoil and love, of watching Marcus discover the joys of parenthood. But those dreams belonged to a different woman, one who still believed her son cared about her. If Marcus wants his children to inherit anything from me, he should have thought about that before he told me I had no value to his family, I said, each word carefully enunciated. "I'm not leaving money to people who despise me." Richard set down his pen and leaned forward, his expression serious. "I have to ask, and please don't take offense, But are you making this decision while you're emotionally distraught? Sometimes it's better to wait, to let feelings settle before making permanent changes. I appreciated his concern, but he didn't understand. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a logical response to new information. I'd spent 35 years believing I was building something for Marcus, sacrificing my own comfort and happiness for his future. Now I knew he didn't want that future to include me, so why should it include my money? I've never been more clear-headed in my life, I told him. For years I've been living under an illusion about my relationship with my son. Last night that illusion was shattered. I'm simply adjusting my plans to match reality. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, if this is what you want, we'll make it happen. But I'm going to recommend some safeguards. What kind of safeguards? First, I want to include a clause that explains your reasoning in your own words. If anyone challenges the will, they'll understand this wasn't a decision made in anger or confusion, but a thoughtful response to circumstances. Second, I want to set up the charitable distributions through a foundation that will bear your name. Your legacy should reflect your values, not your family's rejection of them. The idea of a foundation hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. The Carrie Stewart Foundation, helping people who actually needed help, making a difference in lives that would appreciate the opportunity. It was better than I'd imagined, more meaningful than simply leaving money to established charities. I like that, I said. What else? I want to include a small bequest to Marcus, something nominal like $1,000. It shows you didn't forget him, that this was an intentional choice rather than an oversight. It also makes it much harder for him to claim you were mentally incompetent when you made these changes. The psychological impact appealed to me. $1,000 from an estate worth millions would be more insulting than nothing at all. It would drive home the magnitude of what he'd thrown away with his careless words. Perfect, I agreed. How long will this take? I can have everything drafted by the end of the week if you're willing to pay for expedited service. Given the complexity of setting up the foundation, it might take a bit longer to have everything finalized, but the will itself can be executed quickly. I thought about Marcus and Victoria, probably sleeping late in their expensive bed, planning their expensive renovation, secure in their belief that they'd successfully cut the dead weight from their lives. They had no idea what they'd set in motion, no clue that their inheritance had just evaporated with a few cruel words. Money is no object, I said. I want this done as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Richard made notes on his pad, occasionally asking questions about specific details, charitable preferences, and legal technicalities. We discussed the Foundation's mission statement, the criteria for scholarship recipients, the oversight structure that would ensure the money was used properly. With each decision, I felt a growing sense of purpose, as if I was finally channeling my life in a direction that mattered. By the time we finished, nearly 2 hours had passed. Richard walked me to the door, shaking my hand with the kind of professional warmth that had made him so successful in his field. I'll call you when everything's ready for review, he said. And Carrie? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Your money should go to people who'll honor what you've accomplished. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months, maybe years. The crushing weight of trying to maintain a relationship that had already died was gone, replaced by the satisfaction of taking control of my own story. Marcus wanted me out of his life? Fine. But he'd learn the true cost of that decision soon enough. The afternoon passed quickly as I researched charitable organizations online, reading about their missions and impact, imagining how my money could transform lives. Scholarship programs that helped first-generation college students. Medical research facilities working on diseases that affected women. Shelters that provided safe havens for mothers escaping domestic violence. Each cause resonated with me, reflecting values that Marcus had clearly inherited and then discarded. As evening approached, I found myself in the dining room again. But this time, the space didn't feel haunted by last night's conversation. Instead, it felt like a courtroom where justice had finally been served. The mahogany table gleamed in the lamplight, the china cabinet displayed its treasures with quiet dignity, and the chandelier cast warm light over a scene of peace rather than betrayal. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen counter, no longer feeling the need to set the formal table or create an elaborate meal. Those gestures had been for Marcus, attempts to show love through service, to create moments of connection that he'd apparently never valued. Now I could eat what I wanted, when I wanted, without worrying about anyone else's preferences. My phone remained silent throughout the evening. No call from Marcus, no text message apologizing for his harsh words, no indication that he regretted what had happened. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. He'd meant what he said, and he was comfortable with the consequences. Good. That would make what came next so much easier. I spent the evening going through photo albums, not with nostalgia, but with the clinical eye of someone organizing an estate. Pictures of Marcus at various ages, graduation ceremonies, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. They documented a relationship that had apparently been one-sided, a mother's love that had never been reciprocated with the depth she'd imagined. Some of the photos would go to charity along with everything else. Let other families see what love looked like, even if my own family had rejected it. The rest would probably end up in the trash, because what was the point of keeping memories that had been revealed as illusions? By the time I went to bed, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The decision was made, the wheels were in motion, and soon Marcus would discover what no value really meant. He'd spent his entire adult life taking my love for granted, assuming it would always be there no matter how he treated me. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as I threw myself into researching charities and planning the foundation structure. Richard called daily with updates on the legal paperwork, and each conversation reinforced my conviction that I was doing the right thing. The Carrie Stewart Foundation would outlive me, would make a difference in the world long after Marcus had forgotten my name. I found myself sleeping better, eating with more appetite, taking pleasure in simple activities that had been clouded by worry about my relationship with Marcus for too long. The house felt different too, no longer a shrine to a son who didn't want to be there, but simply a comfortable space where I could live on my own terms. On Wednesday evening, as I was reviewing foundation bylaws Richard had sent over, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment my heart jumped with the old instinctive response. Then I remembered his words, his coldness, the way he'd dismissed decades of love, and I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, I played the message back, curious despite myself about what he might have to say. "Hi, Mom. It's me." His voice sounded strained, uncertain. "I know Sunday night got a little heated, and I wanted to... Well, I thought maybe we should talk. Victoria thinks I might have been too harsh. Anyway, call me back when you get this." I deleted the message without a second thought. Too little, too late, and probably motivated more by Victoria's social concerns than any genuine remorse. If he'd realized the error of his ways on his own, he would have called Monday morning. The fact that it had taken 3 days suggested his conscience was being guided by his wife's public relations instincts rather than any real understanding of what he'd done. Besides, it didn't matter anymore. The legal papers were being drawn up. The foundation was being established, and my new life was taking shape. Marcus had made his choice on Sunday night, and I had made mine on Monday morning. We were both going to have to live with the consequences. The phone rang again an hour later, but this time I didn't even look at the caller ID. Whoever it was could leave a message or try again later. I had more important things to focus on than managing other people's emotional needs. I was finally learning to put myself first, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. I stood in my kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the maple tree in my backyard shed its golden leaves, when Richard's call came through. His voice carried the satisfaction of a job well done. "Everything's ready for your signature, Carrie. Can you come in this afternoon?" "I'll be there at 2. I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. After days of preparation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The drive to Richard's office felt different this time, charged with anticipation rather than grief. I'd spent the week researching every charity that would benefit from the Carrie Stewart Foundation, reading testimonials from scholarship recipients, studying the impact statements from medical research facilities. My money would do real good in the world, would help people who genuinely needed it, rather than funding the lavish lifestyle of a son who considered me worthless. Richard's office smelled of leather and lemon polish, as always, but today the familiar scents seemed to carry a promise of new beginnings. The documents were spread across his mahogany desk like a roadmap to justice, each page representing another step away from the pain Marcus had inflicted. "Before we begin," Richard said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the papers, "I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what we're doing here. Your estate is substantial, Carrie. We're talking about redistributing approximately $2 million in assets, plus whatever accumulates between now and the time of your death." The number hung in the air between us. I'd known my net worth, of course, had tracked every investment in property acquisition over the years. But hearing it stated so plainly drove home the magnitude of what Marcus was losing. $3.2 million, thrown away for the sake of his wife's social climbing and his own inflated sense of importance. "I understand completely," I said, picking up the gold pen Richard offered. "Marcus made it clear that I have no value to his family. I'm simply ensuring that my assets go to people who will value them appropriately." The first signature felt like signing a Declaration of Independence. The second felt like justice. By the time I'd initialed every page and signed every form, I felt transformed, reborn into a woman who didn't measure her worth by her son's approval. "The will is now official," Richard announced, gathering the papers with practiced efficiency. "The foundation paperwork will take another few weeks to finalize, but your estate planning is complete. Is there anything else you need?" I thought about Marcus probably spending his Friday at his law firm, handling other people's family disputes while remaining oblivious to the legal earthquake that had just reshaped his own future. "Actually, yes. I want you to prepare a letter for Marcus, to be delivered after my death along with his inheritance. Nothing elaborate, just an explanation of my decision." Richard nodded, already reaching for a fresh legal pad. "What would you like it to say?" I considered my words carefully, knowing they would be among the last my son would ever hear from me. "Dear Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll have learned that your inheritance consists of $1,000, as required by law to acknowledge you as my son. The remainder of my estate has gone to establish the Carrie Stewart Foundation, which will provide scholarships and support to people who understand the value of love, sacrifice, and family. You told me I had no value to your family, so I've ensured that my money goes to families who will treasure what I had to offer. I hope someday you understand what you threw away. With love, despite everything, your mother." Richard wrote steadily, occasionally glancing up to catch my expression. When he finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with something approaching admiration. "That's perfect, Carrie. Firm but not vindictive. It explains your reasoning without being cruel." "I'm not trying to be cruel," I said, meaning it. "I'm trying to be honest. Marcus made his choice, and this is mine." I left Richard's office feeling lighter than I had in months, maybe years. The burden of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't want me in his life was finally gone, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing my life's work would benefit people who deserved it. The weekend passed peacefully. I worked in my garden, pulling up the last of the summer flowers and preparing the beds for winter. The physical work felt therapeutic, each handful of weeds representing another piece of emotional baggage I was ready to discard. I'd spent too many years cultivating a relationship that had already withered. Now I could focus on things that would actually grow. Saturday evening, I treated myself to dinner at a small Italian restaurant I'd always wanted to try but had avoided, because Marcus didn't like Italian food. The pasta was perfectly prepared, the wine was excellent, and for the first time in years, I ate a meal without worrying about anyone else's preferences or opinions. Sunday came and went without the usual anxiety about family dinner. No frantic meal preparation, no careful selection of topics that wouldn't bore or annoy Marcus, no desperate hope that this time we'd recapture some shadow of our old closeness. Instead, I read a book, took a long bath, and went to bed early, sleeping better than I had in months. Monday morning brought a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Stewart?" The voice was unfamiliar, female, with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested bad news. "This is Rebecca Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital." I'm calling about your son, Marcus Stewart. My coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of ceramic and hot liquid. My heart hammered against my ribs as every worst-case scenario flashed through my mind. What happened? Is he hurt? He was in a car accident early this morning, the voice continued, calm and clinical. His condition is stable, but he's been asking for you. Are you able to come in? The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-remembered prayers. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the cruel words and deliberate rejection, Marcus was still my son. The boy who'd once depended on me for everything, who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when other children were mean to him. St. Mary's smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, its fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. The elevator seemed to take forever, each floor marking another step toward a conversation I wasn't prepared to have. Marcus looked smaller in the hospital bed, his face pale against the white pillows, his usually perfect hair disheveled and slightly damp with perspiration. Victoria sat beside him, her designer clothes wrinkled from what had obviously been a long night, her makeup smeared with tears. "Mom," Marcus said when he saw me, his voice hoarse and vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard in years. "You came." "Of course I came," I replied automatically, the response so ingrained that it bypassed all my anger and hurt. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." He attempted a weak smile, which is pretty much what happened. Some drunk driver ran a red light. Victoria looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, her usual composure completely shattered. "The doctors say he'll be fine, but he has a concussion and some broken ribs. He could have been killed." The words hung heavy in the sterile air, carrying weight that went beyond the immediate medical crisis. Marcus could have died, and our last conversation would have been that terrible dinner where he'd told me I had no value. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had just signed papers ensuring he'd inherit almost nothing, and now here I was, rushing to his bedside, because despite everything, I still loved him. "I'm sorry about Sunday night," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he couldn't bear to look directly at me. "Victoria and I talked about it, and I know I was harsh. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," I interrupted, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "And that's okay, Marcus. Sometimes the truth hurts." He turned his head to look at me then, confusion flickering across his pale features. "Mom, you told me I had no value to your family," I continued, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "You were honest about how you felt, and I appreciated that honesty. It helped me make some important decisions." Victoria straightened in her chair, her tear-streaked face sharpening with suspicion. "What kind of decisions?" I smiled, the expression feeling strange on my face after days of careful planning and quiet satisfaction. "The kind that people with no value are free to make." Marcus struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've finally learned to listen to what you're telling me, instead of hearing what I wanted to hear. You don't want me in your life, and I've accepted that." "Mom, that's not—" Marcus started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish. I spent 35 years building my life around you, making every decision based on what would be best for your future. I worked multiple jobs to pay for your education, lived modestly so you could have advantages, saved every penny I could for your inheritance. And last Sunday, you made it clear that none of that mattered to you." Victoria's face had gone white, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. "Carrie, you're taking things out of context. Marcus was just trying to establish some healthy boundaries." "Healthy boundaries," I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Is that what we're calling it when a son tells his mother she has no value?" Marcus closed his eyes. Whether from pain or shame, I couldn't tell. "I was angry about something else, and I took it out on you. It wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't," I agreed, "but it was honest. And it freed me to make choices I should have made years ago." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the steady beeping of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Victoria was staring at me with growing alarm, as if she sensed that something fundamental had shifted but couldn't quite grasp what it was. "What choices?" Marcus asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, feeling oddly relaxed despite the charged atmosphere in the room. "I've revised my will, Marcus. Since you made it clear that I have no value to your family, I've ensured that my assets go to people who will appreciate them." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock across both their faces. Victoria actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could somehow recall the sound. "What do you mean, revised?" Marcus asked, his voice stronger now, edged with panic. "I mean I've left everything to charity. The Carrie Stewart Foundation will provide scholarships for underprivileged children, fund medical research, support single mothers, people who understand the value of sacrifice and love." Victoria shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "You can't do that. That money belongs to Marcus." "Actually, it belongs to me," I corrected gently. "And since my son made it clear that I have no value to his family, I've given it to families who will value what I've built." Marcus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between shock and dawning comprehension. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter? You told me I was worthless, Marcus. I'm simply making sure my worthless assets go to people who won't consider them worthless." "Jesus Christ, Carrie!" Victoria exploded, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We're talking about Marcus's inheritance, his children's future." "I'm talking about children who exist right now and need help," I replied calmly. "Not hypothetical grandchildren whose father considers their grandmother to have no value." Marcus struggled to sit up despite his injuries, his face flushed with exertion and growing panic. "Mom, wait. We can fix this. We can talk about what happened, work things out." "There's nothing to fix and nothing to work out. You were very clear about where I stood in your life, and I've adjusted my estate planning accordingly." Victoria began pacing the small room like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the floor in an agitated rhythm. "This is insane. You're punishing Marcus for one stupid comment made in anger." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said, genuinely meaning it. "I'm simply redirecting my resources toward people who won't consider my love a burden or my presence an inconvenience." "How much money are we talking about?" Victoria demanded, stopping her pacing to stare at me with wild eyes. I smiled, enjoying her desperation more than I probably should have. "Enough that you might want to reconsider calling me worthless in the future." Marcus fell back against his pillows, his face gray with shock and realization. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean what I said. I was stressed about work, and Victoria's been pushing me to spend more time with her family, and You just told me the truth," I finished for him. "And I'm grateful for that truth, Marcus. It freed me to make better choices with my life and my money." Victoria collapsed back into her chair, her head in her hands. "This can't be happening. We have the house renovation, the new car payments, the country club membership. We budgeted based on money that was never yours," I pointed out. "My money, earned through my work, saved through my sacrifices. If you made financial decisions based on an inheritance you weren't guaranteed, that's poor planning on your part." The room fell silent, except for Victoria's muffled sobs and the mechanical sounds of Marcus's medical equipment. I sat there feeling strangely peaceful, watching my son grapple with the consequences of his words, seeing his wife confront the reality of a future without the windfall they'd been counting on. "There has to be something we can do," Marcus said finally, his voice hollow with desperation. "Some way to fix this." "You could try proving that I have value to your family," I suggested. "But given that you spent an entire dinner explaining why I don't, that might be difficult." Victoria looked up from her hands, mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark trails. "What do you want? What would it take to change your mind?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then I remembered the coldness in Marcus's eyes when he'd dismissed me, the contempt in Victoria's voice when she'd called me a burden, the casual cruelty with which they'd planned to cut me out of their lives. I don't want anything, I said honestly. I already have everything I need: peace of mind, self-respect, and the knowledge that my life's work will help people who deserve it. I stood up, smoothing my skirt and reaching for my purse. The visit had accomplished what I'd hoped it would, giving me closure while showing Marcus the real-world consequences of his choices. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Home. You said you wanted me out of your life, and I'm honoring that request. The nurses can call me if there's a medical emergency, but otherwise, I think we've said everything that needs to be said." "Mom, please," Marcus called after me as I reached the door. "Don't leave like this. We can work through this." I turned back one last time, looking at my son lying pale and broken in his hospital bed, his wife sobbing beside him as she contemplated a future without the money they'd been counting on. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to smooth away his pain the way I had when he was small, but that part of me had been declared worthless, and worthless things didn't deserve space in anyone's life. "Get well soon, Marcus," I said quietly, "and take care of yourself. You're going to have to learn how to do that without depending on my resources." I walked out of that hospital room feeling lighter with every step, leaving behind the last vestiges of the woman who'd sacrificed everything for a son who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. The elevator doors closed behind me like the final page of a chapter I was ready to finish, carrying me down toward the lobby and the beginning of whatever came next. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for a few minutes, letting the reality of the confrontation settle around me. Marcus knew now. Victoria knew. The secret I'd been carrying for less than a week was out in the open, and there was no going back. My phone started ringing before I'd even left the hospital parking lot. Marcus's number flashed on the screen, followed by Victoria's, then Marcus again. I turned the phone off and drove home in blissful silence, leaving them to contemplate the new reality they'd created with their cruel words and careless assumptions. The house welcomed me back like an old friend, its familiar rooms no longer haunted by memories of rejection but filled instead with the promise of a future lived on my own terms. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, surrounded by the furniture I'd chosen, the books I'd collected, the photographs that documented a life of hard work and achievement. Tomorrow, Victoria would probably start calling every day, begging me to reconsider. Marcus would send flowers and cards, trying to rebuild a relationship he'd casually discarded. They'd invite me for dinners, include me in their plans, pretend to value my presence in their lives. But it would all be performance, motivated by greed rather than love, calculated to restore their financial future rather than repair our broken bond. And I would see through every gesture, every word, every manufactured moment of affection. Because once someone tells you that you have no value, you can never unhear those words. And once you've learned to value yourself enough to walk away, you can never go back to settling for less than you deserve. The phone, still turned off, sat silent on the coffee table. Somewhere across town, Marcus and Victoria were probably making frantic calls to lawyers, financial advisors, anyone who might help them understand the magnitude of what they'd lost. But all the lawyers in the world couldn't undo the damage they'd done to themselves with their own words. I sipped my tea and watched the sunset paint my living room walls in shades of gold and orange, feeling more at peace than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new attempts to manipulate me back into the role of devoted mother and convenient bank account. But tonight I was simply a woman who'd finally learned her own worth, sitting in her own home, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a decision well made. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man who valued money more than love, status more than family, appearance more than substance. I'd mourned that loss, grieved for the relationship I'd thought we had, and finally accepted the reality of what we'd become. Now I was free to build something better with the time and resources I had left. The Carrie Stewart Foundation would be my real legacy, helping people who understood the value of opportunity, support, and unconditional love. And somewhere in a hospital room across town, My son was learning that love withdrawn can be just as powerful as love given, that words have consequences, and that mothers who are told they have no value might just take that advice to heart. It was a lesson he should have learned years ago. But some people only understand the worth of what they have after they've thrown it away. The tea grew cold in my hands as the last light faded from the sky, and I smiled into the gathering darkness, finally at peace with the choices I'd made and the woman I'd become. 3 months had passed since that confrontation in the hospital room, and autumn had given way to the sharp clarity of winter. Snow dusted my windowsills as I sat in my living room, reviewing the final documents for the Carrie Stewart Foundation. Richard had outdone himself with the legal framework, creating something that would endure long after I was gone and ensure that my life's work would benefit people who truly needed it. The foundation was now officially established, with an initial endowment that would grow substantially upon my death. Scholarship applications were already pouring in from deserving students whose backgrounds reminded me of my own struggles as a young single mother. Medical research grants would fund investigations into diseases that disproportionately affected women. Support programs for single mothers would provide the kind of assistance I desperately needed but never received during Marcus's early years. My phone had finally stopped ringing constantly. The first few weeks after the hospital encounter had been a symphony of desperation, with Marcus calling multiple times daily, Victoria leaving increasingly frantic voicemails, and even some of their friends reaching out on their behalf. I'd listened to exactly one message from Marcus before deleting the rest unheard. His voice had been thick with tears as he'd begged me to reconsider, promising to be a better son, swearing he'd never meant the hurtful things he'd said. But promises made under financial duress weren't worth the breath it took to speak them. If Marcus wanted to rebuild our relationship, it would have to be for reasons that had nothing to do with money. And given that he'd only reached out after learning about his lost inheritance, I doubted his motivations were pure. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. I'd spent decades filling it with memories of Marcus, keeping his childhood room exactly as he'd left it, displaying photos of every milestone in his life. Now I was slowly reclaiming the space as my own. His room had become a home office where I could manage foundation business. The photos had been reduced to a tasteful few, no longer shrines to a relationship that had existed more in my imagination than in reality. I'd also made some practical changes to my daily routine. The real estate business was thriving as always, but I'd started delegating more to my assistant and taking time for activities I'd neglected for years. Piano lessons had resumed after a 20-year hiatus. I'd joined a book club full of intelligent women my age, who welcomed my perspectives without judgment. Weekend trips to art museums and historical sites filled the time I'd previously reserved for family obligations that had never been reciprocated. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Grief was a strange companion, especially when mourning the death of a relationship with someone who was still alive. There were moments when I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to share some piece of news with Marcus, only to remember that we no longer had that kind of connection. But those moments were becoming rarer, replaced by a growing sense of contentment with my independent life. Linda had been my steadiest supporter through the transition, though even she had questioned my decision initially. "Are you sure you want to burn all bridges?" she'd asked over coffee one gray December morning. "He's still your son, Carrie. People say hurtful things they don't mean." "He meant it," I'd replied without hesitation. Maybe not the specific words, but the sentiment behind them. I've been fooling myself for years about how Marcus really sees me. At least now I know the truth. Linda had studied my face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You look happier than you have in ages. If this is what it takes for you to find peace, then I support you completely." She was right about my appearance. The stress lines that had deepened over years of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't want one had begun to fade. I slept better, ate with more appetite, and found genuine joy in activities that didn't revolve around Marcus's approval or presence. The foundation work had become a particular source of satisfaction. Reading scholarship applications from young people who reminded me of my younger self, reviewing grant proposals from researchers whose work could change lives, meeting with shelter directors who understood the challenges facing single mothers. All of it felt more meaningful than anything I'd done in years. One snowy Thursday in January, I was reviewing applications at my kitchen table when the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, I could see a familiar silhouette that made my heart skip despite my best efforts to remain detached. Marcus stood on my front porch, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his breath visible in small white puffs. I considered not answering, letting him stand there until he gave up and went away. But curiosity won out over caution, and I opened the door just wide enough to see his face clearly. He looked terrible, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and an air of defeat that was completely foreign to the confident attorney I'd raised. "Hello, Marcus," I said quietly, not inviting him in, but not closing the door either. "Mom." His voice was hoarse, whether from cold or emotion I couldn't tell. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you. Face to face." "About what?" He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but determined to continue. "About us. About what I said that night, about what it's cost both of us." "It hasn't cost me anything," I replied honestly. "If anything, it's freed me to make better choices. Can I come in? Please? Just for a few minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around the living room with something approaching wonder, taking in the changes I'd made, the way the space no longer revolved around his presence or comfort. "You've redecorated," he observed, settling onto the couch without invitation. "I've reclaimed my space," I corrected, taking the chair across from him rather than sitting beside him as I might have in the past. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be nice." I busied myself in the kitchen, using the familiar routine to steady my nerves and give myself time to think. Marcus had never come to the house alone before. Victoria had always been with him, directing conversations and controlling the agenda. His solo appearance suggested either desperation or genuine desire to rebuild our relationship without her influence. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, he was studying a photograph on the side table, one of the few remaining pictures of him as a child, taken during a camping trip when he was about 8 years old. His young face beamed with joy as he held up a fish he'd caught, his arm around my waist as I knelt beside him by the lake. "I remember that day," he said softly, accepting the coffee with a slight smile. "You were so proud of me for catching that fish, even though it was barely big enough to keep." "You were proud of yourself too," I replied, settling back into my chair. "You talked about it for weeks." "I've been thinking about that trip a lot lately. About a lot of things, actually." He took a sip of coffee and winced slightly, whether from the heat or from whatever he was about to say. "Victoria moved out 2 weeks ago." The news hit me with unexpected force, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed older than his 35 years. "I know you never liked her much." "I wanted you to be happy," I said carefully. "If she made you happy, then I supported your choice." "Did she make me happy?" The question seemed directed more to himself than to me. "I thought she did. She was beautiful, successful, from the right family. She fit into the life I thought I wanted." "And now?" Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Now I realized that the life I thought I wanted wasn't really living at all. It was just performing, trying to be someone I'm not, impressing people who don't actually care about me." I waited for him to continue, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. "She left because of the money," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, she gave me all kinds of reasons. Said we'd grown apart, that I'd changed since the accident, that she needed space to figure things out. But it all came down to the fact that she'd married someone she thought would be wealthy, and instead she got someone who'll probably never be more than middle class." "I see. Do you?" He looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "Because I don't think I do. I don't understand how I became the kind of person who would say those horrible things to his own mother. I don't understand how I let Victoria convince me that success meant cutting ties with anyone who didn't enhance my image. I don't understand how I threw away the most important relationship in my life for the approval of people who didn't actually love me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with regret and revelation. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to assure him that everything would be all right, To fall back into the pattern of unconditional maternal support that had defined our relationship for so many years. But I'd learned too much about myself and my worth to go backward now. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" I asked gently. "I want to try again," he said immediately. "I want to rebuild what we had, to be the son you deserved instead of the one I became. I want to earn back your trust and your love." "You never lost my love," I told him honestly. "But trust has to be rebuilt slowly, and it requires consistent action over time, not just words." "I know that. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation or desperation that had characterized his previous attempts at reconciliation. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine humility, real remorse, and what appeared to be authentic desire to change. "What about the money?" I asked bluntly. "The inheritance you lost when I changed my will?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it contained the answers to life's difficult questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "I deserved to lose it," he said simply. "I took your love for granted, treated you like an inconvenience, and said things that were unforgivable. Why should you leave your life's work to someone who told you that you had no value?" The answer surprised me with its honesty. "So you're not here to try to get me to change my will back?" "No," he said firmly. "I'm here because I realized that losing the money was nothing compared to losing you. I'm here because I finally understand that I had something more valuable than any inheritance, and I threw it away for the approval of people who never really cared about me." "What makes you think I'd be willing to try again after everything that's happened?" Marcus set down his coffee and looked directly at me, his eyes clear and determined. "Because despite everything I've done, you opened the door when I rang the bell. Because you made me coffee and listened to what I had to say. Because you're my mother, and some part of you still hopes I can be better than I've been." He was right, though I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Some deep part of me still held on to hope that the boy I'd raised with such love and dedication was still there somewhere, buried under years of ambition and bad choices, and his wife's toxic influence. "If we were to try to rebuild our relationship," I said carefully, "it would have to be on very different terms than before. I won't go back to being the mother who sacrifices everything for a son who takes it all for granted." "I wouldn't want you to," Marcus replied immediately. "I don't want to go back to being the kind of person who would take advantage of that sacrifice. I want to be someone you can be proud of again, someone who adds value to your life instead of just taking from it." The phrase "adds value" wasn't lost on me, and from his slight wince, I could tell he'd heard it too. But instead of backing away from the painful memory, he leaned into it. "I know I can't take back what I said that night," he continued. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done to us. But I'd like the chance to prove that I was wrong, that you do have incredible value, and that I was too selfish and stupid to see it." I sat quietly for several minutes, weighing his words against everything that had happened between us. The rational part of my mind warned me to be cautious, to protect myself from further disappointment and pain. But the mother in me, the part that remembered rocking him to sleep as a baby and cheering at his baseball games and crying with pride at his law school graduation, wanted desperately to believe that redemption was possible. "What would rebuilding look like?" I asked finally. Marcus straightened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. "I don't know exactly. I was hoping we could figure it out together. Maybe start with regular phone calls, graduate to occasional dinners, see if we can find our way back to each other. And if we can't, if too much damage has been done, then at least we'll know we tried," he said quietly. "At least I'll know I did everything I could to make amends for the worst mistake of my life." I looked around my living room, taking in the changes I'd made, the life I'd built for myself in the aftermath of our estrangement. I'd found peace in my independence, satisfaction in my foundation work, contentment in relationships that didn't revolve around obligation or guilt. Did I really want to risk that hard-won serenity for the uncertain prospect of reconciliation? But as I watched Marcus sit there, genuinely humble for perhaps the first time in his adult life, I realized that I'd never truly forgive myself if I didn't at least try. Not for his sake, but for mine. Because some part of me would always wonder what might have been possible if I'd been brave enough to extend one more chance. "We can try," I said finally, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "But it has to be a real relationship, Marcus. Not you performing the role of dutiful son until you get tired of the effort. Not me going back to making your needs more important than my own. Something honest and mutual and sustainable." "Yes," he said immediately. "That's exactly what I want. And the money question is settled. The foundation is established, the will is final, and I'm not changing it. If you can accept that, really accept it, then we can move forward. If you can't, then this conversation ends here." Marcus nodded without hesitation. "I accept it completely. You earned that money, and you have every right to decide where it goes. The fact that you're using it to help people who need it instead of leaving it to someone who hurt you shows exactly the kind of person you are. The kind of person I should have appreciated instead of taking for granted." "All right then," I said, feeling simultaneously nervous and hopeful. "We can try." The smile that spread across Marcus's face was like watching the sun emerge from behind storm clouds. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of the boy he'd once been, the child who'd looked at me like I hung the moon and stars. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I swear I'll do everything I can to earn it." "We'll take it slow," I warned. "I need to see consistent change over time before I'll fully trust that this is real." "I understand completely." We talked for another hour, carefully beginning the delicate process of rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by cruel words and years of neglect. Marcus told me about his life without Victoria, how he'd been forced to confront the person he'd become and the values he'd adopted. I shared some of what I'd learned about myself during our estrangement, the ways I'd grown stronger and more independent. It wasn't the easy reconciliation that movie endings were made of. There were awkward pauses, painful memories that couldn't be smoothed over with good intentions, and moments when the gulf between us seemed impossibly wide. But there was also something I hadn't felt in years, genuine hope that we might find our way back to each other. When Marcus finally left, promising to call later that week, I sat alone in my living room feeling emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. The foundation documents were still spread across my kitchen table, representing the good that would come from my life's work regardless of what happened with Marcus. That safety net made it easier to take the risk of opening my heart again. Over the following months, we began the slow work of rebuilding trust. Marcus called regularly, not just when he needed something or felt obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to talk. We met for coffee occasionally, then graduated to dinners at neutral restaurants where we could focus on learning about each other as the people we'd become, rather than clinging to memories of who we used to be. He told me about his job, his genuine passion for helping clients navigate difficult legal situations, his growing understanding of what really mattered in life. I shared stories about the foundation, the scholarship recipients whose thank you letters moved me to tears, the research projects that were making real differences in people's lives. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild something that resembled a functional relationship. Not the codependent dynamic we'd had before, where my identity was wrapped up in his success and his comfort depended on my sacrifice, but something healthier and more sustainable. The real test came in June, nearly a year after that terrible dinner that had started everything. Marcus called on a Tuesday evening, his voice excited in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I have some news," he said without preamble. "I've been seeing someone." My heart stuttered slightly, old fears rising before I could suppress them. "Oh? Her name is Sarah, and she's wonderful. She's a nurse at the Children's Hospital, divorced with a 10-year-old daughter. She knows all about what happened between us, about the mistakes I made, and she's been encouraging me to keep working on our relationship." "She sounds lovely," I said, meaning it. "She is. And Mom?" He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "I'd like you to meet her. Not because I need your approval, but because you're important to me. And I want the people I care about to know each other." The invitation was everything I'd hoped for during the dark days of our estrangement. A sign that I was truly welcome in his life again, not as an obligation or burden, but as someone whose presence added value to his world. "I'd love to meet her," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. We arranged dinner for the following weekend, at a small restaurant Sarah had suggested. I spent the week feeling nervously excited, trying on different outfits and worrying about making a good impression. It reminded me of being a teenager preparing for a first date, except the stakes felt somehow higher. Sarah turned out to be everything Marcus had described and more. She was warm without being effusive, intelligent without being pretentious, and clearly devoted to both her daughter Emma and to Marcus. More importantly, she treated me with genuine respect and interest, asking thoughtful questions about my work and listening to my answers as if they actually mattered to her. "Marcus has told me so much about you," she said over dessert, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "About the sacrifices you made to raise him, about your success in real estate, about the foundation you've established. I'm so impressed by everything you've accomplished." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hit me unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had expressed genuine admiration for my achievements without wanting something in return? When had anyone last seen me as a complete person rather than just Marcus's mother? "Thank you," I managed, blinking back tears I hadn't expected. "That means more than you know." Marcus was watching the interaction with something approaching wonder, as if he was seeing me through Sarah's eyes and finally understanding what he'd been too blind to see before. Later, as we said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot, he pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said quietly. "I know I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the businesswoman you became, the strength you showed during the divorce, the way you're using your success to help other people. You're an amazing woman, and I'm lucky to be your son." The words I'd waited decades to hear finally came, not because I'd demanded them or manipulated him into saying them, but because he'd finally grown into the kind of man who could recognize and appreciate them freely. As I drove home that night, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with Marcus's approval or love. The Carrie Stewart Foundation was thriving, providing scholarships to deserving students and funding research that would help future generations. My real estate business continued to prosper, built on relationships of trust and expertise, rather than desperation for validation. My personal life was rich with friendships and activities that brought me joy independent of anyone else's needs or opinions. Marcus was part of that life now, not as its center or primary focus, but as one important relationship among many. We saw each other regularly, talked frequently, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. When he and Sarah got engaged the following spring, I was genuinely happy for them. When they asked me to help plan the wedding, I was honored to be included but not overwhelmed by the responsibility. The wedding itself was beautiful, a small ceremony in Sarah's parents' garden, with Emma serving as junior bridesmaid and looking absolutely radiant in her pink dress. I sat in the front row, watching my son promise to love and honor a woman who clearly brought out the best in him, and felt nothing but gratitude for how everything had worked out. During his toast at the reception, Marcus looked directly at me and said, "I want to thank my mother, Carrie Stewart, for showing me what real strength looks like, for never giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself, for teaching me that love isn't about taking everything someone offers, but about appreciating and honoring what they give you." The applause that followed felt like vindication for every difficult choice I'd made, every moment of doubt I'd endured, every time I'd questioned whether I was doing the right thing. The boy I'd raised with such love and hope had finally grown into a man worthy of that investment. 5 years later, I was sitting in my living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, reading thank you letters from the latest batch of Foundation Scholarship recipients, when Emma burst through the front door with the kind of exuberant energy only 8-year-olds possessed. "Grandma Carrie!" she shouted, launching herself into my arms with complete confidence that I'd catch her. "Guess what? I lost my first tooth." I admired the gap in her smile and listened to her breathless account of how the tooth had come out during lunch at school, how she'd wrapped it carefully in a napkin, how excited she was for the tooth fairy's visit. Marcus and Sarah followed behind her, Marcus carrying their new baby, Thomas, and both of them wearing the slightly frazzled but happy expressions of parents managing 2 children. "Sorry we're early," Sarah apologized, settling onto the couch beside me. "Emma was so excited to show you her tooth that we couldn't convince her to wait." I'm always happy to see you, I replied, meaning it completely. How's Thomas doing? Finally sleeping through the night, Marcus said gratefully, gently placing the baby in my arms. Sarah's been amazing, but we're both exhausted. I looked down at my grandson, marveling at his tiny fingers and perfect features, and felt the kind of uncomplicated joy I'd almost forgotten was possible. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or burden, but genuine affection freely given and received. Why don't you two go take a nap? I suggested. Emma and I can look after Thomas for a few hours. Are you sure? Sarah asked, though the hope in her voice suggested she was already imagining the luxury of uninterrupted sleep. Absolutely. We'll have a wonderful time, won't we, Emma? Emma nodded enthusiastically, already planning the games we'd play and stories we'd tell. Marcus kissed my cheek before heading upstairs, the gesture so natural and affectionate that it transported me back to his childhood, when such moments of connection had been routine rather than precious. As I sat there with baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in my arms, and Emma chattering beside me about her plans for spending the Tooth Fairy money, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain of that terrible dinner when Marcus had told me I had no value seemed like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. I'd learned that my value wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition or appreciation, that I was complete and worthwhile whether or not my son acknowledged it. The foundation that bore my name was helping hundreds of people every year, my business continued to thrive, and my personal relationships were built on mutual respect rather than desperation or obligation. Marcus had learned that love freely given was infinitely more valuable than anything taken for granted, that relationships required nurturing and attention to survive, and that true success was measured by the quality of connections rather than the accumulation of status symbols. We'd both grown into better versions of ourselves through the painful process of separation and reconciliation. The relationship we had now was stronger and healthier than what we'd lost, built on honesty and mutual appreciation rather than habit and assumption. The will I'd changed in anger and hurt remained unchanged, not because I wanted to punish Marcus, but because I'd discovered something more important than leaving money to family. I'd found my true legacy in the lives the foundation would touch, the opportunities it would create, the research it would fund. That legacy would outlive us all, creating ripples of positive change that would continue long after both Marcus and I were gone. But that didn't mean I loved him any less. If anything, I loved him more now that our relationship was based on choice rather than obligation, on genuine affection rather than genetic accident. He was my son not just because I'd given birth to him, but because he'd earned that place in my life through consistent actions and authentic change. As the afternoon sun slanted through my living room windows, casting everything in golden light, I held my sleeping grandson and listened to my granddaughter's cheerful chatter and felt a deep sense of peace. This was what happiness looked like, not the desperate grasping after other people's approval that had defined too many years of my life, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who chose to be there. The woman who'd sat at that dinner table 5 years ago, being told she had no value by the son she'd sacrificed everything for, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more content with the life she'd built for herself. Marcus had been wrong that night when he'd said I had no value. But his cruelty had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover my own worth independent of anyone else's opinion. And that discovery had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.